It was clear that the boy named Ning Que felt no remorse about this scene. In fact, one could say he lacked any sense of sympathy or compassion. He lay comfortably on a bamboo lounge chair, with his left hand flipping through a slightly worn book, while his right hand idly traced patterns in the muddy ground with a sturdy twig. Occasionally, when he fell into deep thought, he would toss the twig aside, stretch his open palm toward the air, and, moments later, the small maid would place a perfectly warm cup of tea in his hand. The soldiers in Viking had long since grown accustomed to the daily rhythm of this small courtyard and saw it as a matter of course, but the noble maidservant standing outside the fence observed, with an increasingly cold gaze, her face growing as frosty as if covered by a layer of ice. She watched the frail maid tirelessly juggling her tasks, cooking, cleaning, all the while alert to Ning Que's needs, ready at any moment to pour tea, knead his shoulders, or even massage his back, not daring to relax for an instant. The frostiness on the noble maid's face deepened, her expression so icy that it seemed ready to freeze solid. If she were truly your maid, it would be one thing. But isn't she the one you rescued from a pile of corpses? Weren't you just supposed to rely on each other for survival? Even if she is your maid, don't you think she's far too young to bear such heavy labor? And yet, here you are, already so young, and you've managed to nurture a lazy, indifferent spirit. Why can't you do some of the work yourself? Perhaps it was some unpleasant memory from her own childhood that had been stirred, or perhaps the boy's cold behavior had shattered her ideas of compassion too thoroughly. The maid pushed open the fence gate and walked straight into the courtyard, her gaze falling upon the bamboo lounge chair, then skimming over the worn book. A hint of mockery seeped into her tone as she said, "I thought you might be reading some great work of wisdom, something that allows you to ignore everything around you. But it turns out to be just a common Tai Shanganing Pian, a book anyone could pick up in the marketplace. And you, of all people, actually have the nerve to aspire to the path of cultivation." Ning Que sat up, calmly observing this woman in luxurious clothing who seemed utterly out of place amid Viking's rugged environment. He glanced at the officer, whose face was tinged with embarrassment, and after a brief pause, he responded calmly, "It's just the only book I could find, so I read it out of curiosity, nothing more. No aspirations." The maid hadn't expected such a calm and unruffled response from the boy, which made her pause for a moment. She cast an annoyed glance at the little maid by the door, busy dumping ash from the stove, and said coldly, "In the Grand Tong Empire, I've never seen a man so shameless as you." Ning Que raised an eyebrow, following her gaze to the girl standing by the window. He caught the disdain in the woman's tone, and a dimple appeared briefly on his left cheek as he responded with a hint of playful mischief. "You seem older than me, so let's just say I'm not yet a man, just a boy." The maid had likely never encountered someone so slippery and impudent. Her hand tightened slowly within her sleeve, her expression hardening further, and she looked ready to lash out. But then her gaze landed on the densely inscribed writing in the muddy ground beside the bamboo lounge chair. Her eyes lingered there, a flicker of surprise flashing in her gaze, momentarily making her forget what she was about to say. Meanwhile, in the best quarters of Viking, an elderly man in a worn-out robe sat with his eyes closed, resting serenely. Beside him stood Ma Shixiang, the military commander, bowing slightly, his voice respectful and cautious as he reported to the esteemed guests within the tent. However, his expression betrayed a trace of barely concealed astonishment. "You disapprove of the guide?" Ma Shixiang asked, a hint of puzzlement in his tone. "Why?" The esteemed person inside the tent responded with evident displeasure, rebuking, "What I need is a sharp and capable guide, not a lazy youth, lost in foolish dreams of cultivation, whose only skill seems to be carrying roast chicken." Ma Shixiang coughed lightly, lowering his voice to explain. "As far as I know, though young, Ning Que has killed several barbarian enemies on the plains over the past 2 years. If only a few unexpected incidents arise along the way, he should be more than capable." The Tang Empire was built on military prowess, and achievements in battle were paramount. Though Ma Shixiang knew how distinguished the person inside the tent was, he was not afraid to assert himself when it came to the army's highest honor. Though his explanation was respectful, it subtly carried an air of challenge. There was a pause, then a cold response from within the tent. So killing qualifies one as a suitable guide. Ma Shixiang's reply grew even more respectful, though his tone was firm. Among the 300 soldiers here in Viking, Ning Que may not have the highest kill count. However, I would stake my life on this, no matter how dire the battlefield. If anyone remains standing, Ning Que will surely be among them. Ma Shixiang gave a faint smile and looked up. With his accumulated military merits, he received a letter of recommendation from the military department. The boy has indeed proven himself. He passed the preliminary evaluation half a year ago. Now he's heading back to the capital to formally enroll in the academy. At the mention of the academy, silence filled the tent, and the distinguished guest fell silent. After Ma Shixiang withdrew, the elderly man in the worn robe slowly opened his eyes. His calm, aged gaze now showed a rare glimmer of interest. He looked toward the partition in the tent, smiling with a touch of admiration. To think a soldier from this remote little town could be accepted into the academy. That is indeed unexpected. Given this, the boy's character and abilities must be quite remarkable. Perhaps he is indeed a suitable choice for the role of guide. But only a year has passed since the kingdom's reunification, and now even the sacred grounds of the academy are admitting these crude military types. The guest replied, his tone still cold and dismissive. However, there was a clear shift in his stance. The reputation of the academy evidently held a special power enough to alter even the prejudices of one as distinguished as he. A single name, academy, had evoked this respect, indicating that it must truly be an extraordinary place. The old man paused for a moment, his expression shifting as he turned to another topic, speaking with slight confusion. I went to look at the characters he wrote in the mud earlier. He was copying the third section of the Taishang Gaining Pian. The strokes were simple yet full of vitality. Despite being written with a twig in the wet earth, every line seemed to carry a sharpness, as though a blade were being applied to the soil. This soldier, named Ning Que, seems to have already entered the proper way of calligraphy. I truly don't understand how he achieved this, or which master he has studied under. The noble guest responded coldly, that soldier is nothing more than someone with a fine hand for calligraphy. I glanced at it once, and thought it fresh and striking. But upon further thought, it's just a trivial skill. In the future, he may just end up being one of those street calligraphers outside the capital's fragrance workshops. There's no true path to speak of. The old man shook his head slowly, then said, what you referred to as fresh is actually the key point. I don't understand calligraphy, but from the characters he drew with that twig, I could faintly sense a quality akin to metal and stone. There's a kind of spirit in his writing, very rare. It even reminded me of the methods used by those experts in the Taoist talismanic arts. You mean talismans? The noble guest behind the curtain was momentarily stunned. Then, with a hint of sarcasm, said, in this world, there are billions of people, yet there are only a handful of true masters in the talismanic arts. These experts either live in seclusion within the palace or sit in isolation, dedicating their lives to meditation and years of hard practice, so they can gather the breath of the heavens and earth into their golden strokes and silver lines. That boy doesn't possess any aura. He's just an ordinary mortal. Even if he studied the Taishang Gaining Pian for 50 more years, he wouldn't even step into the preliminary stages. How could he possibly be compared to those great talisman masters? The old man smiled slightly, not engaging further in the argument. Though he was a cultivator and had earned the noble guest's respect in the camp, their status and positions were vastly different. The so-called respect was more out of pity for the elderly and a fondness for talent, given that some things were better left unsaid. However, he didn't entirely agree with the noble guest's view. In the mundane world, those who could understand the breadth of heaven and earth and enter the path of cultivation were indeed extremely rare, and the difficulty of starting was immense. The initial stages of cultivation were the hardest to reach, far from easily attainable. However, if Ning Que truly had the opportunity to enter the academy and, by some twist of fate, ascend to the legendary second floor to begin his cultivation journey, then the unique and powerful calligraphy he held in his hands would undoubtedly serve as a great aid on his path to cultivation. Even if Ning Que could never grasp the mysteries within, his calligraphy alone would be enough to make the experts in the academy and Taoist circles view him with new respect. At the very least, it would stir up some excitement among the scholars and calligraphers. Ning Que put down the Taishanganing pian, shook his head with a trace of subtle disappointment and unwillingness, and slowly walked toward the door. This book was something he had bought as a child when the grain convoy had gone to the market in Kaiping. As the noble lady's maid had said, it was widely available in the market and was not at all valuable. Ning Que knew this very well, yet he still tirelessly read it over and over, as though it were the legendary 7 volumes of the celestial scripture worshipped in the celestial heaven, in some unknown place. Though this book was almost falling apart, its pages torn and fragile as if they would scatter to pieces at any moment, had it not been for the fact that Sang Sang sewed the spine together with cotton thread, it would have long turned to ash, scattered by the wind to honor the toil of the ancient sages. As time passed, the pages had worn out, and the words of the book were deeply etched in his mind, yet he still could not discern the slightest way forward. Let alone the initial stage of cultivation, he couldn't even achieve the simplest feeling described in the book. He had once felt despair from his failures, even moments of complete hopelessness, but as time passed, he gradually realized that the vast majority of normal people could never comprehend the breadth of heaven and earth, and his heart slowly found peace. Yes, those legendary recluses were not ordinary people, but rather rare outliers. Only these exceptional individuals could perceive the breadth of heaven and earth. Otherwise, with so many copies of Taishanganing pian circulating in the world, why had no one ever heard of flying swords flashing across the night sky in the capital, Chang'an, or of immortals floating by? Ning Que was very clear that he was nothing more than an ordinary person, even perhaps the most ordinary of people. Yet, suddenly before him appeared a wondrous treasure mountain, but he could only return empty-handed. The world was filled with a mysterious energy, something like invisible clouds, a force called Yuan Che, but no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't grasp even a single fragment of those clouds. This sense of loss and helplessness inevitably stirred a feeling of unwillingness. He sighed softly, looked up at the general in front of him, and spoke calmly. Viking is so barren, and the barbarians from the grasslands have long been intimidated by His Majesty's military might. They haven't dared come for many years, therefore, military achievements can't be accumulated quickly. Having the opportunity to return to the capital is, of course, a good thing. How could I feel unwilling? In the dimly lit military camp, Ning Que respectfully bowed to the general, his voice sincere. However, since there is still some time before the enrollment date for the academy, I don't think there's any need to rush leaving. Although I haven't achieved anything remarkable during these years, under your command, I am grateful for your guidance, which has allowed me to gradually become more like a soldier. Otherwise, I wouldn't even have had the chance to enroll in the academy. I truly hope to stay in Viking for a bit longer, to be able to learn more from you. Even if it's just doing some trivial tasks or chatting idly, it would be a great honor for me.